So we're on day 2, and I have to give you a heads up, guys. This is going to be a really tough day. We're in Lent, and Lent involves both crucifixion and resurrection. Today is going to be about crucifixion, and tomorrow, God willing, is going to be about resurrection. So we're really going to go into kind of the depths of. Yesterday, I focused on what I consider to be the sources of evil. And today I want to look at the consequences of evil. So we're going to take some really deep diving, and it's going to get perhaps even upsetting for all of us. But it is necessary, as Christ did, you know, after the transfiguration, there was Calvary and crucifixion, you know, and 3 days in the darkness, and then resurrection. And that's what I'm hoping to do in these 2 days here, to lead us through the crucifixion of the consequences of evil into the resurrection of our mission on planet Earth, you know, as souls on safari or spirits in spacesuits. So if you look at your handout on lecture 3, it's titled Consequences of Evil. And I'm going to make 3 main points here. I'm going to talk about conquest and colonialism. And I'm going to divide that into 2 subsections, you know, conquests, kind of foreign invasions, and then secondly, internal wars. Then the second point will be about refugees and borders. And then thirdly, simplistic analyses and pseudo-solutions. So that's where I go in the morning lecture. So let me begin then. I'm sure most of you know of Jane Goodall and her extraordinary work. She lived among the chimpanzees in a place called Gombe in Tanzania for many, many, many years. And what you may not know of is something really, really bad that happened in that community of chimpanzees between 1974 and 1978. And it is now known as the Gombe Chimpanzee War. And what happened was a violent conflict broke out in the community of chimps. Now, in this community, there were originally 14 males, 15 females, and a whole bunch of young people. But by 1974, Goodall began to see that the community was splitting into 2 separate groups. And over the next 4 years, she watched in horror when all of the males of the breakaway community were killed by the old community, effectively disabling the new community. And even former friends and even mentor figures, you know, were against each other and killing each other. So at the end of 1978, the entire new community was wiped out. And what really upset her was that the victors didn't just kill the others, they celebrated boisterously, throwing and hooting and dragging branches and jumping up and down, you know, on the dead bodies of their former comrades. So this came as a huge shock to Jane Goodall, who considered chimpanzees to be similar to human beings, although she said much nicer in their behavior. And the clincher was, in the middle of that series, in 1975, she saw a high-ranking female of the community cannibalize her own infant. So that was a total shock for her. This, you know, genocide within the group and this cannibalistic behavior where a high-ranking female killed and literally devoured her own infant. Now, why am I starting with that? Because the lesson for me is that, you know, we share 98.8% of our DNA with chimpanzees. So we're in the same lineage. So that for me would be actually a 9th source of evil in our. It's the fact that we come from a lineage, a pre-human ancestry, which was very violent, engaged in genocide and, you know, ethnic cleansing in a sense. And so as we dive into human behavior, that's just another source of our evil, that we inhabit physical spacesuits, which are descended ancestrally from previous primates who engaged in the same kind of behavior that we find ourselves doing. So it all stacks up, and we begin to see the antecedents for the behavior we engage in as a human species. So let me get on to point number 1 then, you know, conquests and colonialism. I've made this claim many, many times, that there's not a single tribe or culture living anywhere on planet Earth which is not occupying land which was taken violently from previous occupants. There is no place anywhere on planet Earth in which the present occupants are not in land which was taken violently from previous occupants. Going way, way back when Homo sapiens came out of Africa, over the course of maybe 70 or 80,000 years, they wiped out all the previous occupants of Europe, the Neanderthals, they got wiped out, of the Russian area, the Denisovans, we have evidence for their existence at this stage, and further east to Homo floresiensis in Asia. And so as we came out of Africa as Homo sapiens, we systematically wiped out all of the other hominid species that we encountered. So this is a very, very old trajectory. Every single one of us belongs to a tribe or a culture which is engaged in genocide and ethnic cleansing and murder. So we have to fess up and take responsibility and not just be pointing fingers, at the present group of bad guys, whoever we consider them to be. There are enough fingers to go around to point at all of us in our history. So I've traced for you yesterday that when you look at world history, even recorded history, which just goes back about 6,000, or 7,000 years, you'll find that the first great empire, at least in the Levant, in the Middle East, was the Akkadian Empire. And that was overthrown by the Assyrian Empire, who in turn were overthrown by the Babylonians, who in turn were overthrown by the Persians. Meanwhile, Egypt was doing its own thing, its own kind of conquering. They were getting into it with the Assyrians, they were getting into it with the Babylonians, and finally with the Persians. The Persians overcame the Babylonians and they overcame the Egyptians. And then the Greeks came in under Alexander the Great, and they wiped out the regime in Egypt and also of Persia. And then at some stage, the Roman Empire took over and it wiped out the Greek Empire, taking over occupying all the lands that the Greek had conquered, including Egypt. And then the Roman Empire kind of went into demise in the 4th and 5th centuries. And by the 6th and 700s, the Moorish, the Muslim Empire, was sweeping across the world and into Europe, right across into Spain, and occupying various parts of what would now be Anatolia and Turkey and places like that. And that went on until the rise of two other empires, the Portuguese and the Spaniards, in the late 1400s, early 1500s, who began to conquer. The Portuguese went to East Africa, particularly Zanzibar, Angola, places like that. And the Spaniards went both east and west, South America and Mesoamerica. And then at some stage, they were overthrown by the British Empire. And the British claimed to have an empire on which the sun never set. But actually, in fact, the British Empire was not the most extensive empire ever. The Mongolian Empire under Genghis Khan was the biggest empire ever when you're looking at a contiguous empire. The British Empire was particular locations in various parts that weren't geologically or geographically connected. The Mongolian Empire was the biggest empire ever on the planet when you talk about contiguous, kinds of countries that they occupied and overthrew. And then you had the US Empire, probably beginning with the Spanish-American War in 1812 up to our own times. And now the mantle is moving, it seems, further west again until it gets to China. So again and again and again, you see that we have a history of lands being occupied by newcomers and cultures being overtaken by new cultures. And that's part of the human journey. So all cultures, black cultures, white cultures, red cultures, yellow cultures, brown cultures, including matriarchal cultures, all engaged in genocide, civil wars, and ethnic cleansing. So in order to understand the situation in which we find ourselves now, we have to have a sense of history and the fact that there's enough blame to go around for all of us. So as we attempt solutions, we must all take responsibility and not just have one group of people pointing fingers at a current group of people. This was born into me when, as a child growing up in Ireland, we learned to kind of hate the British. And we learned that, in 795, the Vikings invaded Ireland. And then in 1169, the Normans came and stayed. And then the 1500s, the British came. And then in 1922, we kicked out the British and we got our freedom. Until I realized, I was proud to be a Celt. Until I realized that when I studied history, the Celts, they were not the original occupants of Ireland. The Celts came in and they overthrew a group called the Tuatha Dé Danann in two famous battles, in County Sligo in Ireland. And the Tuatha Dé Danann had overthrown a previous group called the Firbolg, and the Firbolg had overthrown a previous group called the Fomorians. So there's no place in which there's not just one conquest after the other, so that the present occupants of any part of planet Earth, are invaders in some sense of the word. And so what are we going to do about that? What is the solution when we realize that all of us are guilty and all cultures have been guilty of this? Now, part of the problem is we have learned to romanticize war. In previous ages, the most colorful people in society were soldiers dressed up in these extraordinary headdresses and uniforms and medals on their chests before we discovered camouflage. And so, we feted them, and we had bands marching them into war, and heroes departed, and they were going to come back with chestfuls of medals. And what happened was, if they came back at all, they came back not with chestfuls of medals, but without legs or arms, or sometimes even their sanity. Now, it's fascinating to me that, rightly so, women have raised the claim, take your hands off my body. That, people are not allowed to dictate to women their own health, even their own kind of lifestyle. Take your hands off my body became a great rallying cry for women's liberation, and rightly so. But men don't have the same right. Men have never had the same right to say to society, take your hands off my body. Young men have been conscripted into armies since war began as cannon fodder for the agendas of oligarchies, even to today. There are places in the world where still men do not have the right to say, take your hands off my body. They are marched as cannon fodder for these wars. So in this lecture, I'm literally going to create a war sandwich, because I want us to feel emotionally, not just intellectually. I want you to feel emotionally what it is like, to be engaged in a war situation. So I've chosen 2 anti-war songs to kind of make a sandwich of this lecture today. So I'm going to ask now Karen to play the first one for us. It's a song that comes from Australia during the beginning of World War I, when Australian men were being shipped to Europe to fight against the Turks who were allied to the Germans. So here's a song called Who'll Go a Waltzing Matilda With Me.
Right now I'd like to do one that's been probably one of the most requested songs that I get around the pubs, and I've been dying to record this one. It needs no introduction. When I was a young man, I carried a pack. I lived the free life of a rover, from the Murray's Green Basin to the dusty outback. I waltzed my Matilda all over. Then in 1915, the country said, son, there's no time for roving, there's work to be done. And they gave me a tin hat, and they gave me a gun, and they sent me away to the war. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as a ship pulled away from the quay. And amidst all the cheers, the flag waving and tears, we set off for Gallipoli. How well I remember that terrible day when our blood stained the sand and the water, and how in that hell that they call Suvla Bay we were butchered like lambs at the slaughter. Johnny Turkey was waiting, he primed himself well, showered us with bullets and he rained us with shells, and in 5 minutes flat, well, he blew us to hell. He nearly blew us right back to Australia. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as we stopped to bury our slain. We buried ours and the Turks buried theirs. Then we started all over again. So those who were left just tried to survive in a mad world of blood, death and fire. And for 10 weary weeks I kept myself alive as the corpses around me piled higher. Then a big turkey shell knocked me arse overhead, and when I awoke in the hospital bed, I saw what it had done, and I wished I was dead. Then I knew there were worse things than dying, and I'll go no more waltzing Matilda all through the green bush far and free. 'Cause to hunt and tent peg a man needs both legs. No more waltzing Matilda for me. They collected the crippled, the wounded, the maimed, shipped us all back to Australia. The legless, the armless, the blind and insane, the brave wounded heroes of Suvla. And as our ship pulled into Circular Quay, I looked at the place where my legs used to be, and I thank Christ there was nobody waiting for me to mourn and to grieve and to pity. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as they carried us down the gangway. Nobody cheered, they just stood and stared, then turned all their faces away. And now every April I sit on the porch as I watch the parade pass before me. I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, reviving old dreams and past glories. But the old men march slowly, bones stiff and sore, tired old men from a tired old war. And the young people ask, what are they marching for? And I ask myself the same question, and the band plays Waltzing Matilda as the old men still answer the call. Year after year more old men disappear, soon none of them will march there at all.
That's what war is like, guys. And we still celebrate it. And we still create it. We hand out medals and sing songs and wave flags. And when we're finished killing the enemies, then we start killing our friends, which is the next point I want to make. I want to talk about internal wars, because what I've seen again and again and again in human history is that once the colonialists have been defeated and kicked out, the civil war begins. We turn on each other. We did this in our country here beginning in 1861. We did it in Ireland in 1922 once we had gotten rid of the British. India did it in August 15th, 1945, after they had wrested independence from the British Empire, and the creation of India happened on the 15th of August 1945, and immediately there was a split between Pakistan and India, which still lasts to our day. Two nuclear powers threatening each other across their borders. Most of the countries in Africa which had been colonized by Europeans in the 16, 17, 1800s got their independence in the 1960s. And immediately civil wars broke out all over Africa. There are 54 countries in Africa, and most of them experienced immediately civil wars. So let's just have a look at continent by continent. You look at Europe, for instance. In the 1500s, we had the Inquisitions beginning, where literally Christians turned on each other and literally pulled each other to pieces on the rack during Inquisitions. We had the religious wars that started after the beginning of Protestantism, where Northern Europe and Southern Europe were at war with each other for hundreds of years and tens of thousands of lives. And then we savaged each other as Europeans between 1914 and 1945 in two great world wars that killed almost 100 million of us Europeans. In Africa, I lived in East Africa from 1972 to 1986. And during that time, Idi Amin came to power in Uganda, which was our neighbor. And Idi Amin in his regime killed over 300,000 of his fellow Ugandans. In 1994, in a 100-day period from May to July 1994, in a civil war in Rwanda, the Hutu tribe slaughtered 900,000 Tutsis, men, women, and children, with machetes mainly, sometimes with guns, ably abetted by religious figures within the Hutu tribe. A recent survey showed that between 1995 and 2015, that 20-year period, 5 million African children under the age of 5 died because of internal conflicts in their countries. You go to Asia and you see what happens there. With under Mao Zedong, it's very hard to get definite figures, but between 1958 and 1962, during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao is attempting to make a transition from an agricultural-based, society to an industrial, somewhere between 15 million and 55 million Chinese people died of famine conditions. And in another country in Asia, under the Pol Pot in Cambodia, 20% of the entire population was wiped out in a civil war during that period. In the Americas, just a simple example, under the Aztec Empire, it's reckoned that 250,000 Mexicans were sacrificed every year to the gods, these bloodthirsty gods. And in fact, in 1487, during the dedication of a very big temple, 80,400 people were sacrificed in 4 days. That's 20,100 people a day sacrificed to these gods. So we have learned to kill each other, by identifying enemies outside of us, and then by identifying enemies within. So that's a consequence of evil in our world. That's my first point. Wars and conquests. Secondly, I want to look at this, the phenomenon of refugees and of borders. When Ellis Island was opened on the 1st of January in 1892, welcoming immigrants, particularly from Western Europe at that stage, the very first person to be admitted was a little 15-year-old girl called Annie Moore from County Cork in Ireland, where I'm from. And she came with her 2 younger brothers. And they were trying to escape poverty because of foreign occupation and ongoing war. And I'm sure Annie Moore didn't think when she was boarding that craft and hoping for freedom, who am I displacing at the other end? Are there First Nations people? Are there Native American Indian people whose land I'm now going to occupy and whose resources I'm going to indulge in? Was the furthest thing from her mind. She was a poor child trying to escape poverty and warfare and occupation, and to save her 2 little brothers. And you get the very same thing happening today. All over the world, refugees are people who have been displaced and who are seeking a better life for themselves and for their children. And they can't even begin to think, who am I displacing? If I move and I emigrate someplace else, who am I displacing? Do I need to think about those and just stay where I am in my poverty and watch my kids die of hunger? And what I've seen again and again and again, that refugees are created by 4 kinds of conflict. They're created by internal wars, civil wars in their own countries. They're displaced by foreign colonialist regimes coming in where they shouldn't be. They're subject to what I would call cultural colonialism, that some countries are propagating an image of themselves that's inviting everyone, you can have this great life like us as well, that they see in our movies and in our kind of media. And then there's what I would call economic colonialism or industrial colonialism, where we're ravaging resources in other countries, where we sell our products to them at the price that we determine, and we buy from them their products at a price that we also determine. And so all these kinds of colonialism are continuing to create refugees. Now, the question is not so much what are we going to do with the refugees? That's an important question, but it's not the most important question. The more important question is, what is causing refugees? Why are people leaving the places they were born in and loved? And they're doing it because of warfare, created, internally or externally. So there's no point in trying to, if you spill a glass of water on the table and it's flowing off the table onto the floor, and you get a cloth and you start wiping up the floor while it's still coming off the table, you're not going to solve the problem. The first thing you need to do is set the glass upright so it's not spilling onto the floor anymore, and then mop the table, and then finally deal with the floor. We have to begin dealing with the causes of refugees, and it's always about colonialism of various kinds. Internal conflict, or economic colonialism, or cultural colonialism, or war-based conquest from the outside. Until we begin addressing those issues, we're not going to ever solve the refugee problem. If these activities were to stop, people want to stay where they grew up. I have an aunt married to my uncle, whom I actually am 2 months older than him, and her name is Marie. Marie has never lived more than 1 mile from the house in which she was born in 1945. Because people love to stay and to live where they belong, in a culture, among friends and people whom they know, as long as they can make a living and feed their children. And so, I begin to look then at the refugee situation that we face in our world right now. And I ask myself the question, how many caravans do you think are lining up to immigrate into Russia right now? How many caravans do you think are lining up in order to immigrate into China right now? So why is it that our country is so appealing to them? And it is good that there's a place that they can come. But at the same time, suppose 1.5 billion Chinese decided to emigrate to the United States in the next 10 years. Would they be welcomed? Could we accommodate them? Or what would happen to our country? So it is very, very important that we don't come up with simplistic analysis of extraordinarily complex human situations and then apply pseudo-solutions and simplistic solutions. So I'm going to give a few kind of metaphorical examples here. As we begin to wrestle with the notion of refugees and borders, it is a very, very complex issue. And it deserves that we use our spirituality, our sociology, our psychology, and our science in order to create long-term solutions to extraordinarily complex human issues, and not say, on the one hand, give them back, let's all go back to where we belong and give back the land to the Native Americans. And at the same time, let's open up the borders and let's everybody else come in and take the land that once belonged to the Native American population. That's really simplistic thinking. We need to be thinking much more deeply of these really, really complex issues, so we analyze them for what they really contain, and then create solutions at a worldwide level that are going to create long-term peace on our planet. So I'm going to just take the notion of dreams as a psychologist and start applying dream technology to this phenomenon right now. In psychology, we realize that when you dream of a house is a kind of the archetypal symbol of the psyche. And indeed, Jesus knew that himself. He talked about the houses built on firm ground as distinct from houses built on sand. And he's talking about the psyche, which means the soul. The soul has to be grounded in really, really good foundations. So when you're dreaming at night and you dream of a house, here's how I kind of interpret it. The walls of the house represent your physical body, your sacred space. The windows represent your senses, your connection to the outside, so that you have perceptions and you're gathering data from the world outside yourself. And the doors represent your ability to control ingress and egress, your ability to create boundaries and contact with others, according to your own needs. And one of the most devastating illnesses you'd have to treat as a psychologist is to meet somebody with a borderline personality disorder. And the borderline personality disorder comes from an early childhood in which the privacy of the child is not respected. There's no sacred personal space for the child. The main caregivers invade constantly. And you get a personality that oscillates between idealizing the other and being raged at the other. And very, very often suicidal ideology as well. So when you don't respect a child's boundaries and you don't offer their physical bodies and their sacred space, you know, the right to be separate from, you destroy your children. So that's what dreams mean. When you look at the dream as a kind of the house as a symbol of the family, here's what it means to me. You think of your family right now. The walls, again, define the boundaries and it sets limits around the family system. The windows allow the family to be aware of and to perceive what's happening in the outside world. And the doors allow the family to control their own inner environment, who may come in and who may not come in. So the house is a symbol of the family itself. I guess that there's none of you, you know, who goes to sleep at night with your front door open. You want to protect your family against just people who will wander by and come in and raid your fridge or sleep on your couch or whatever. And so you're creating a boundary around your family to protect them. But you can invite in those whom you want, and you can decide who you want and who you don't want to be in your home. The house then is also a symbol of the nation. And so here, the walls represent the borders to safeguard the citizens. And the windows represent international diplomacy, our contact with the outside world and with other nations. And the doors represent our immigration policies, our ability to control, you know, who comes in and who doesn't come in. And so the world community must be like a family whose sacred space is respected. There's a very big difference between invasion and invitation. And therefore, every individual, every family, and every culture has the right to determine what are appropriate boundaries and windows and doors to their nation or to their home. And it is very simplistic to think that we can just throw open our doors and expect, you know, that our fridges aren't going to be raided, our people aren't going to occupy our houses and squat there as an individual family or as a nation itself. It is a very simplistic solution to say, let's open all our borders to everybody and let 1.5 billion Chinese come in, you know, and, you know, all of Ireland come here if they want to, you know, and we'll support everybody. We have to analyze very complex situations with extraordinary intelligence and spirituality and sociology and psychology, and then come up with solutions that work for everybody involved in the equation. So what we're doing right now is simplistic solutions and what I would call pseudo-solutions. You know, this kind of thinking, let's all go back to where we belonged and give back this land to the First Nations people who were here before we invaded in, you know, in the 1500s or whatever. At the same time, open borders and let a whole bunch of other people in to occupy the land of these Native American Indians to whom we're trying to give back their land. It's really, really simplistic thinking. So you take a typical American today, you know, who's third or fourth generation America, who's been, their parents, their grandparents, maybe even their great-grandparents have been born in this country. And now you tell them, go back home. You don't belong here. This belongs to the First Nations. So now you have a person who has four grandparents. One of them is from Nigeria, one is from Australia, one is from Sweden, and one is from Ireland. Where are you going to go back to? You go back to Nigeria, Ireland, Australia, Sweden. Where do you go? And when you get there, where are you going to live? The place you once occupied or your great-grandparents occupied, there are other people living there now. The house your grandfather was born in is now host to a totally different family. What are you going to do? Go back and displace them? And so this is kind of really simplistic thinking. So who owns a land, for instance? We landed on the moon. As Americans, we landed on the moon in July of 1969. Nobody else has stepped foot on the moon since then. Does the moon belong to us? Does it just belong to the two astronauts who landed on the moon the first? Or do the guys who landed on, let's say, Apollo 14, Edgar Mitchell, whom I had the privilege of knowing, he was the sixth man to walk on the moon. Can he share? Does he own part of the moon? Or does the moon belong to the United States of America as a country? Or to us, the taxpayers who funded NASA? At the moment, we have got rovers on Mars. The Chinese are about to land on Mars, and the United Arab Emirates are about to land on Mars. So to whom does Mars belong? Are we going to divide up Mars into three sections? Yeah, and if other groups want to go there, are we going to forbid them? And when we go further afield and begin to conquer other planets in our solar system, to whom do those belong? The people who were alive there first, or the nation that sent them? So it's really simplistic thinking to talk about, give back or go back, or invite everybody to come in. If we were to divide up the entire planet right now, there's a very simple calculation to estimate the surface area of a sphere. It's 4 pi r squared, where r is the radius. So the radius of planet Earth is 4,000 miles. So when you say 4 pi r squared, when you take the surface area of planet Earth and you divide it by, let's say, the population of the world is almost 8 billion people right now, you divide up the surface area of the planet by 8 billion people and you give everybody an equal share. Now we have to adjust it because 70% of the land, 70% of the planet is actually underwater. So only 30% is dry land. If you were to divide up the dry land of planet Earth among 8 billion people, every single one of us would be entitled to 4.8 acres of real estate. So is that a solution? We got 4.8 acres each. Now, what about the guy who gets 4.8 acres in downtown Manhattan? And the other guy gets 4.8 acres in the middle of the Gobi Desert. Is that fair? Or do you have to put a dollar amount, on all of the world's resources, whether it's land or fishing rights or precious metals, create a dollar amount for all of that and then divide that by 8 billion people and give each one of us, a chunk of change? Is that going to solve our problems? There's a system called Pareto's Law. Pareto was an Italian economist who lived in the 1800s, and he created this extraordinary, he came to this realization that's called the Pareto principle. And he found out, just by looking at the data in a whole bunch of areas, this principle that 20% of any population will create 80% of the wealth of the entire group. And this is right across, it's not just among humans. 20% of criminals will create 80% of the crimes. 20% of drivers are responsible for 80% of road accidents. 20% of factories are responsible for 80% of pollution. 20% of the world population own 80% of the world's resources. If you take a game like soccer, the most widely played game on the planet, 20% of soccer players are responsible for 80% of the goals scored. And you take any solar system, 80% of the mass of a solar system is in 20% of the planets. So if you take our solar system, you take the two big giants, the gas giants called Jupiter and Saturn account for 20% of the mass of our solar system. And finally, 20% of buyers are responsible for 80% of the complaints made on their purchases. And so it's a very, very simplistic thing to think that you could just take the world's resources, divide it equally among everybody, put a dollar amount in it, give the same amount to everybody else, and everybody will be really happy forever and ever, amen. Literally within a single generation, Pareto's principle will have ruled. There will be people who are not prepared to work. The parable that Jesus told us about the talents, there's some guys get 5 talents and they go in, they make 5 more. Some guy gets 2 talents, he makes 2 more. Another guy with 1 talent and he buries it. He's not prepared to work. So there will be people who are not prepared to work, and there are people who are addicts of various kinds. They're going to drink their money or gamble their money or whatever. And then there are people, who are discriminated against because of the systems we put in place. So it's not simply that the systems create poverty. There's a lot of different factors that go into the fact that 20% of the world's population will own 80% of the world's resources. It's a complex phenomenon. So we need very, very complex solutions to it. We need to really think really, really deeply as a human community. To analyze the issues, they're multifaceted, it's a multivariable equation which cannot be solved by a fundamentalist mindset that reduces complex things down to kind of bumper sticker solutions and then do this and everybody is going to be dead happy. So I want to end this part of the lecture today. I've called this a war sandwich. So I want Carden to play a second anti-war song. And this is from an Irish musical group called the Furies. And it's called Willie McBride. And there's a story about somebody walking through the death fields of France, where millions of, tens of thousands of World War I soldiers are buried. And this was her lament. It's called Willie McBride.
Well, how do you do, young Willie McBride? Do you mind if I sit here down by your graveside and rest for a while, neath the warm summer sun? I've been walking all day and I'm nearly done. I see by your gravestone you are only 19 when you joined the Great Fallen in 1916. I hope you died well, and I hope you died clean. Our young Willie McBride, was it slow and obscene? Did he beat the drum slowly? Did he play the fife slowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? And did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Did you leave a wife or a sweetheart behind? In some faithful heart is your memory enshrined. Although you died back in 1916, in that faithful heart are you forever 19? Or are you a stranger without even a name, enclosed and forever behind the glass frame, in an old photograph, torn, battered and stained, and faded to yellow in the brown leather frame? Did he beat the drum slowly? Did he play the fife slowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? And did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? The sun, now it shines on the green fields of France. There's a warm summer breeze that makes the red poppies dance. And look how the sun shines from under the clouds. There's no gas, no barbed wire, there's no gunfiring now. But here in this graveyard, it's still no man's land. The countless white crosses stand mute in the sand. To man's blind indifference to his fellow man, to a whole generation that were butchered and damned. Did he beat the drum slowly? Did he play the fife slowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? And did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Ah, young Willie McBride, I can't help wonder why do those that lie here know why did they die? And did they believe when they answered the call? Did they really believe that this war would end war? Well, the sorrow, the suffering, the glory, the pain, the killing and dying with all the done in vain. For young Willie McBride, it all happened again. And again, and again, and again, and again. Did they beat the drum slowly, did they play the fife slowly, did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Did they beat the drum slowly, did they play the fife slowly, did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? And did the pipes play the flowers of the forest?
So I wanted us just to be able to feel, the evil of war, not just intellectually appreciate and deal with statistics and numbers and causes. I wanted us to feel what it's like to have an emotional connection to these generations after generations after generations of human beings who have suffered because of the agenda of whoever's orchestrating, this kind of behavior. And I have one request, during the Q&A, and it is that you'll notice in all of my homilies, all of my lectures, I stay completely away from partisan politics, and I never mention any politicians by name. I don't want this to be about, which side of the aisle you're on. This is about looking at the human condition, its antecedents, the events, and the kind of trajectory. I don't want to hear any partisan politics or politicians' names mentioned. Thanks a million. And as a very, very good friend of mine, I know the details of that story, and my hat's off to you for the courage you displayed and the time you put in social work instead of, being a member of a military outfit. Thank you for your courage in doing that, brother. Thanks. Thank you. And I realize that you were in the military yourself and served because you believed that you were, defending your country. And I totally, hats off to anybody who's prepared to put their life on the line for any cause. However, I think it's very important to look at not just the downstream effects, of war at some stage, but the antecedents and what causes it in the first place. We've been trying war now on this planet since before the Sumerians. We're going back 7,000 years. We have 7,000 years of trying to solve human problems by killing human beings, and it has never worked. And the great leaders, the great avatars have always told us it will not work. The Gandhis of the world, the Jesus Christs of the world, the Nelson Mandelas of the world, the Mother Teresas of the world, they've all showed us that you can't solve human problems by killing human beings. And so we have to back up and say, okay, well, if we hadn't intervened, in 1939 or whatever, such and such might have happened. But the truth is, you look back at what caused World War II, and it was World War I, how we treated Germany after World War I. And so there's always, well, they did this to us, yeah, but that was because we had done this to them beforehand. So it becomes like the mafiosa, with revenge. We're going to wipe out their family because they wiped out my uncle, and they're going to tell me, well, the reason we wiped out your uncle is that you killed our great-grandfather 3 generations back or whatever. We've been trying war now for 7,000 years and it hasn't worked. So we need to be trying something else. I remember very well, the very first homily I gave after 9/11, I made this appeal. I said, we can respond to this now by creating a war reaction to it, which is exactly what we did. And I said, instead of that, if we declared a moratorium on war for 5 years, and for 5 years we brought the great thinkers of the world, sociologists, psychologists, spiritual leaders, industrialists, economists, educationalists, all of these people, ecologists, and figure out, is there a better way to be doing life as a species on planet Earth? And let's put all war on hold for 5 years until we come up with a master plan which will allow all human beings and all species on the planet to avail themselves of their needs and have access to the resources, and put that kind of brain power into creating solutions other than war. But of course we didn't do it. We went in and we're still there in Afghanistan after bombing the hell out of them. And then going into Saddam Hussein claiming that he had weapons of mass destruction, which was a total fabrication. So again and again and again, you get, false flags that allow us to give us the excuse to go in and to kind of use a violence solution to a human problem. So I totally appreciate the men and women who put their lives on the line to defend their countries. What I'm taking issue with is the oligarchs and the manipulators who made it necessary for those people to put their lives on the line for any cause whatsoever. There must be a different way of solving human problems than taking human lives. Totally agree with you. That's a great point. Aren't open to looking at and dialoguing with the issue. So I'm not going to reveal a name here, but somebody very, very close to me and who's online right now, whose father was captured during World War II, and was held in France in a farmer's house. And subsequently, this German soldier and this French farmer became such good friends that every single year, this German man took his entire family on vacation to France and spent their vacation time with this French family. So here's what can happen when people can look beyond uniforms and look beyond causes and see other human beings instead. So can I tell you one of my favorite ETs who gave that very same message? Jesus Christ. And by all accounts, he's an ET. His dad was not belong to this planet. A hybrid. So, I mean, in some senses, ETs have been among us since the beginning in all traditions. And that I totally agree with. I've been fascinated by this topic for many, many years. In fact, I did a whole retreat for COJ on this topic at Bishop's Ranch many, many years ago. And that is the essence of the message. So I really, really applaud it. Thank you for putting it so succinctly in. It's a brilliant story, but it's wonderful. And I want to just make one kind of a comment on it. The family praying the rosary for the welfare of this important member of the family is beautiful. We have to be really careful that what we're praying for is about peace, not just about, our side, coming back safely. I'm reminded of the fact that the rosary was really invented on the 7th of October, 1571, after the famous Battle of Lepanto, when the Christian Europe's forces were taking on the Muslims in a sea battle at Lepanto, and they got victory on the 7th of October, 1571, and they dedicated it to Mary's, the feast of Mary's Rosary. So can you imagine that Mary, the Mother of God, is playing sides in a war game between Muslims and Christians? So we have to be really, really careful that when we appeal, to God or to Mary or others, that we're looking for peace and healing for everybody and not just the people that we hold tender for ourselves.